I just wanted to say that when I talk about my dad a lot of times to my kids, it sometimes sounds like we spent a ton of time together. Like he was super involved in my life. And that's just not the case, unfortunately. When we were with him, it was great. And I loved my dad very much and wish that that had been my story. But the reality is that, typical 70s, 80s growing up kid, there were a lot of divorces that started to happen in the late 60s, 70s. And that whole, I grew up where I didn't really know hardly anybody whose parents were still together. And so I think we all have a similar story where maybe our dads were kind of absent in our lives, some more so than others. My dad had his own demons that he was fighting, and he went through some really difficult times regarding alcohol. He went through a lot of trying to figure out himself as a man, and I think a good portion of that had to do with his own upbringing and his own relationship with his dad that was such a struggle for him. And for men of that generation, trying to figure out how to be dads was difficult because so many of them just didn't have that modeled for them. So growing up, my parents never truly lived together during my lifetime. They were married until I was 3. But my dad, those 3 years, my dad was in and out all the time. My dad worked construction and frequently worked long distances away from home. And so he would be gone for long periods of time, and my brother and I would be at home alone with my mom. My mom was the constant in our life. And I have some memories of him when I was very, very young, during that first 3 years. My first really true memory is a really sad memory about my dad. My dad had come, he had come back from a job that he had been on. They had fought. I remember just the horrible fighting and my dad leaving and slamming the door. And I was standing out on the front walkway and he walked past me. And I just remember in my little legs running down the sidewalk saying, "Please don't leave, please don't leave, please don't leave." And he got in and he drove away. And I, like a toddler will, threw myself on the sidewalk and just beat my feet and my hands on the sidewalk, crying and crying until my mom came out and got me because I didn't want my dad to leave. And that was probably a lot of the relationship that we had growing up. My dad, obviously, he came back when I was 3, loaded us all up into a truck, and up to Alaska we went. My dad was going to work on the pipeline. And I remember sitting in his lap, getting to drive the truck, which was always cool. But I remember sleeping on the road, the drive up there, in the floorboard of this truck, and the radio playing, and it was always playing country music because that's what my dad liked to listen to. And then I remember just lots of my dad not being there. My dad had cheated on my mom many, many times. And this started long before we ever moved to Alaska. And my dad had been a pastor for several years. That was not a great job for a woman who struggled with women. And my mom you know, she was from the generation where you just put up with it. And so she did. She forgave, she forgave, she forgave. She ignored, she looked the other direction, all of that. And I guess I was about 4, and my dad had come back from working on the pipeline, and he had taken my brother with him to a motel, and there was a woman there. And my brother, not knowing any better, I guess, told my mom about it when he got home. And my mom wanted to know, could you find it if I drove you back over there? So she loaded us into the car, and back we went. And I remember the knock on the door, and I remember a woman answering the door, and my dad coming out of the bathroom wrapped in a towel. And then I remember the car ride home, which was scary. I was a little kid. And I remember saying, Mom, I think you just hit that guy. And she's just driving, tears streaming. And she had hit somebody on a motorcycle and was so distraught she didn't even realize it. And, you know, the police came, and there was a whole ordeal with that. And that was really the real end to my parents' marriage. My dad ended up marrying that woman, and I have to say, although for many years I held a lot of resentment for that situation, it wasn't my marriage. My dad was my dad, my mom was my mom. It wasn't my marriage. It was that was their deal, their mess. And there came a point when I was able to forgive the woman that he had had this affair with and who he had married. And we became extremely good friends, and we are friends to this day. And my dad was not good to her either. There was infidelity during that relationship as well. And that's really truly what ended their marriage, is she had had enough, and it became too in her face, too public. She couldn't ignore it anymore. And so my dad struggled. When I was a kid, he would call, sometimes regularly, most of the times not. It became my brother's job to make those monthly phone calls to remind him to send the child support. That was really an unfair position to put my brother in. Once again, it wasn't our fault. None of this had been our fault. We were born into this relationship, and somehow the fallout fell on our shoulders. He never should have had to have been reminded, but he was, and often didn't pay, and that was always difficult. At one point, my mom had to take him to court because he owed so much back child support. That turned into a big thing because they discussed separating me and my brother, my dad taking my brother, my mom taking me, and I don't think either one of them thought that was a good idea, and I'm incredibly grateful to them. I don't know that my dad's story was always that he wanted us to be close, and that's why he said no. I don't really believe that. I think he knew he was not in a position to do what was best for my brother and to be able to father him in a day after day kind of way. And I'm grateful for that, because I do have a close relationship with my brother and I love him very much. And had we been raised in different households, that would not have been the relationship that we had. And I've thought many times, what would it have been like if I had been raised in my dad's home? And I can't even imagine. I struggled with my own stuff growing up, and so I can't imagine what it would have been like to have been raised in a home that had, where I probably would have raised myself more than anything. I probably would have been a huge mess. My dad would sometimes schedule times for us to visit with him, and then he would not show up. I remember many of these, but one in particular where we were going to go to Disneyland, and I remember sitting out on the curb for hours waiting for my dad to come until it was practically dark and my mom made me come inside. And then there would be the arguing over, you know, when the next phone call would happen because you didn't show up. Do you know what that did to your daughter? Do you know what that did to your son? All of that. What I didn't realize at the time was that my mother was actually sending letters to my dad saying things like, remember, Tammy's birthday is November 2nd. You remember that, don't you? After we moved into this house and I started going through the boxes and boxes and stacks of paperwork and photos and old letters and things, I found just tons of letters that my mom had sent that were reminders of when his children's birthdays were. Don't forget to call on this birthday. Don't forget that Tammy's birthday's coming up. It would mean so much if you called her. And there was always a connection between my mom and dad. Even once they were divorced and remarried, and my dad would come to pick us up, and you could kind of see that the two of them still cared about each other, and that never really went away. But I also was not one of those kids who ever wanted my parents to be married. So sometimes years would go by and I wouldn't hear from my dad. There was a lot of that. So he'd show up, he'd be really consistent, and then he would just kind of disappear for a while. Now, years later, I not only found stuff here at the house, but after we reconnected, he shared a lot of stuff with me, and I realized he was battling alcoholism for a while. And just going through some stuff that he had to deal with. And so as an adult, I can look back and go, you know, it was better that my brother and I not be around that. So graduating from high school would be a typical example. He was invited months and months beforehand, and up until the actual event took place, I never heard. Was he coming? Was he not coming? He didn't come. And it broke my heart. Never really understood either side, my dad's side or my mom's side, because I wasn't a parent. Now that I'm a parent and I have children who I have raised and are adults of their own, or are adults and have their own children, and I have younger children, I know how difficult it is to be a parent and the struggles you go through and the way you beat yourself up.